In this video, I'm going to talk through some of the considerations you need to make when looking at kind of an analysis of biodiversity and species diversity using a quite quantitative approach, because there's a lot of terminology and a lot of statistics which gets used very much just within this context. And it can take a little while to get your head around some of the concepts and some of the limitations of those concepts as it relates to species diversity. In general, what we're trying to do with any kind of assessment of what the level of species diversity is within a given environment. And even before you get started, there's quite a few different questions when you come to design a study to try to assess this. First of all, you need to work out what it is that you mean by an environment. Is it something you have a tight set of clear geographic boundaries around a forest or a field? Is it something at a much higher level, which perhaps still is quite predictable, like you covering a river or different components of a river? How would you determine which parts of the river count as different environments to other parts of the river? And then you may even be looking even higher level than that and trying to assess diversity within a region or a county or a whole country. So getting that level of environment defined from the start is one of the most important questions to even be able to start this process and work out the best way to try to characterize what the species diversity is within there. And usually you'll be in the case where that first question is either pretty obvious, and then this next question is more difficult to assess, or vice versa, where the first question was kind of hard to answer, and then this second question of what species, what taxa, what family of species are we interested in assessing the diversity of? Because we may be more focused on the species itself more so than the environments. We may be trying to understand differences in diversity patterns of birds or rodents or macrofauna and capturing different environments to compare across. Or it may be that we're specifically interested in understanding a particular river and the diversity within that particular river. And then we have this more difficult question of, okay, what should we be considering as different species within that river? Should we be separating out into different families? Should we be trying to assess everything altogether? So having good answers to these first two questions will then make the process of coming up with a design a little bit more clear, because there's lots of different methods which can be used to try to collect data here, which depends a lot on the environment you're working in, as well as a species that you are trying to sample and count. Whether you're doing a sort of transect sample and then taking a soil sample to look at some of those small macrofauna or even bacteria within the soil sample, versus you're dealing with a savanna in Africa and you've set up video cameras to try to count the number of elephants that appear over the course of a week, and the number of hyenas and the number of other large mammals. Very different methodologies would be needed for very different contexts. And there's also a question of what should we be recording about the animals that we observe. The first thing that we need is to know how many there are, but then should we also be capturing some other measures to help us get a more nuanced understanding of diversity, whether that's the size, the age, the sex, if there's any health markers we could capture about the species that we're observing. That information could help us provide a much richer analysis further down the line, rather than the more straightforward option, which is often not very straightforward at all, of trying to count the members of each species within our environments. So the data we're going to consider to look at some examples of is maybe one extreme of how you can go about trying to classify species diversity. And this is the RSPB's Big Garden Birdwatch, which I think claims to be the biggest citizen science project in the entire world. There were 610,000 households in the UK who recorded every bird that they saw in their garden on a particular weekend in the 2024 version of this survey. And here we have kind of a context where that first question of what species are we interested in assessing is one pretty easy to answer. We're interested in every bird. Doesn't matter how big, how small, we want to count all of the birds. That question can be answered quite easily. The environment question, in terms of how we may look at this data and how we may analyze the species diversity, is a little trickier to try to assess, because we do have one quite clear definition of environment being the gardens of every household who reported. But that's something which we have 610,000 of, and we're unlikely to really get into too much analysis at that very, very micro level. So we're going to want to maybe create some higher level arbitrary environments at county level or maybe country level. And that in itself brings in some challenges because of the sampling process. We definitely do not have any sort of random selection of sampling locations here. It's very self-selection in terms of who is going to participate in this particular survey. We may have large areas of the country where no one is participating. We may have communities who've got really engaged in this process, and lots of people in the community are reporting all the birds that they see. So we may have to consider how random and how representative the sample that we get is of the wider population. And we'd also have to think about how our species interacts with those environments. Birds aren't particularly known for following administrative borders of counties or countries. And particularly, they may end up being counted on multiple occasions by the same household, perhaps, or even by different households in different counties. So there's lots of things we might want to consider about how much this data can tell us about the diversity of birds, but in terms of the scale of the data available, this is something which couldn't be achieved by any other means. So we're going to have an incredibly rich source of data, and because it's done every single year, we can get a nice rolling time series to look at how the diversity profile is changing within the birds in the UK. So I'm going to zoom in on one particular county, Merthyr Tydfil in Wales. I'll explain why I've picked that a little bit later. But here on the screen, I've got every bird that has been observed in the Great Big Garden Birdwatch over the past 2 years in 2023 and 2024, with the average count of those birds per household. And we've got 2023 on the left, 2024 on the right. Lots of different birds being observed. We can see just visually looking at the pattern, the distribution looks relatively similar without going into the details. At the top, we can see in both years the house sparrow was the most commonly observed bird, around 7 to 8 birds per household on average, or sparrows per household on average, observed in both of the years of the survey. And then as we go down, we've got blue tits, blackbirds, robins, and so on, which were relatively common, all the way down to lots of these birds which were seen very, very rarely, sort of less than 0.1 times per household. So likely just a few households were able to spot just one of those birds who participated in the survey. And so the question we might have, if we are a resident of Merthyr Tydfil or someone interested in the diversity of birds in Merthyr Tydfil is, okay, visually it doesn't look like too much has changed, but there's a lot of numbers there and a lot of information. So have there been any changes in the bird diversity between 2023 and 24? And if so, how? And kind of the easiest thing to assess here is to simply count how many different birds we saw in 2023 and how many different birds we saw in 2024. And we can add them up, and in 2024 there were 44 different species observed, and in 2023 there were only 38 different species observed. And this is a measure that we call species richness. It sounds like that should have a more complicated definition, but it really doesn't. It's simply the number of different species observed in a species diversity exercise such as this. So if we're clarifying that in percentage terms, that's a pretty decent increase year on year, 16% increase of species observed in 2024 compared to 2023. There is always one very important caveat when we're dealing with species richness now, which is identifying some of those rare birds is going to be very sensitive to the sampling design that we have. The more locations we have and the longer we observe, the more likely we are to see some of those very rare species. Just because we didn't see it in 2023 doesn't mean it wasn't there. And especially because this is a different set of households participating. Probably there's a lot of the same households who participate every year in this survey, but there's no guarantee that we've got the same households in 23 and 24. There'll be some who are only in one year, some who are only in the other year. And so that identification at county level of how many species there are needs a little bit of an asterisk around it, because it is going to be so sensitive to how many people participated and whether we're seeing a similar set of sublocations within our county participating as well. When we think about another measure of the diversity, that would be thinking about how many birds in total were observed across all of the different species. And we'd call that the total abundance combined across all of the species. And again, this word abundance, it sounds like it should be a more complicated statistical measure. It really isn't. You just add up the total across all of the species. That's a little bit more challenging in this data set because we only have an average number of birds per household. And as I said before, we probably have the same birds being accounted for in multiple households, particularly within a county, I would imagine, where it's maybe flown just across the road and then been seen somewhere else. But we have a reasonable measure here. We'd perhaps consider it to be the average abundance per household rather than a total abundance across the whole county. But if we look at the data, we see that we have a decrease in the total abundance of birds. So even though we saw more different species, we saw 44 rather than 38, the average number of birds seen by each household was only 33, when it was 37 in 2023. So we have one measure of species diversity going up. We have another measure, not so much of diversity, but one which links strongly to diversity in terms of this total abundance, which has gone down. And we would use that total abundance number to help us calculate our dominance statistic, which is looking to understand for our most dominant species, which in Merthyr Tydfil in both years was the house sparrow, what percentage of the total population is that species representing? And this statistic is sometimes called the Bergen-Parker dominance score. I'm not sure why it needed two people to come up with the score, since it is simply that proportion of the total population. And if we look at both of our years, it's very similar. It's about 22% of the total population, which is made up of house sparrows in both of the years. And this statistic is most useful when we have a single dominant species, because the pattern of dominance can be a little bit more complicated if there's perhaps two different dominant species, and we maybe want to consider that in terms of how those two species fit into the wider population. And we may start running down that string of thinking, what if we have three? What if we have four? And so this dominance concept linked more widely to the concept of evenness. And this concept of evenness helps us to think of the whole population and understand whether we have a well distributed set of abundance figures across all of our species, or whether we have a very uneven spread of our species. So if we look perhaps beyond just the most dominant species in Merthyr Tydfil, there's a couple which are highlighted in purple there, where we do see a few species with quite consistent declines between 2023 and 2024. I think I picked out the blackbird and the starling and the feral pigeon, where the numbers we saw in 2024 were well down on what we'd see in 2023. And there's quite a few cases where that happens, and as a knock-on effect, we still have a similar dominant species, but then we have more species which have fewer observations and fewer abundance counts. Therefore, our evenness as a whole has actually decreased between 2023 and 2024. It's harder to come up with a statistical measure which is particularly intuitive for evenness. There's this measure called Pilau's J, which is linked very strongly to the Shannon index, and it's actually calculated as a direct function of the Shannon index, which I'll talk about shortly. But as a measure of evenness, if this has a score of 1, then that would mean every species is equally abundant in the population. If it has a score of 0, that would mean there is only one species and it has a 100% of abundance figure for the whole population. So as we increase that score, the more even population we have. It's another question when we start to think about species which maybe have different levels of impact on our environment. Do we even want all of our species to be evenly distributed in a perfectly diverse environment? If we had 100 tigers and one ant, is that a sensible structure for a population? Is that a diverse structure for our population? And vice versa, if we have 100 ants and one tiger, maybe that seems like a more sensible structure. In both cases, though, we'd have a same score of evenness and the same knock-on effect on all of our diversity calculations. So this is where perhaps we need to think about whether we adjust the abundance counts by other factors, whether that's biomass, whether that's some metric of environmental importance or environmental impact, or something else completely. We may want to think about whether it even makes sense to treat all of our species as equals when we try to assess diversity. So we've seen richness going up, we've seen evenness going down. What does that mean for diversity as a whole? And this is where you have what we refer to as the alpha diversity indices. I think lots of people are fairly familiar with the names of these and having seen these applied, which are the Shannon-Wiener index and the Simpson index, which get taught quite often to people learning about statistical ecology. They're often a little bit overused or a little bit badly understood. So I'll try and break down a little bit what these two indices are. I've put the formulae on the screen just to kind of show you what they are. Part of the reason why they are so commonly applied is because these are relatively simple formulae to calculate. You can do it in an Excel file pretty quickly. Lots of people have Excel template files specifically to calculate these indices. That lack of nuance for how they can be calculated, though, comes with the trade-off of what they can actually say. So both of them are a function of both richness and evenness. So the maximum possible score you can achieve in both of these indices increases with the richness. And then the closer the score will get to that maximum score is determined by the evenness of the distribution of the species. In terms of the Simpson index, that comes as a probability. So in an infinite size population, it could possibly get up to almost but not exactly 1. It would get to 0.9999 recurring as the maximum possible score you could get. So the higher it is, the more diversity you have within that population. As a probability, it's the probability that you take any two random samples of members of your population and they would come from different species. So if the probability there is down to 0, that would mean that you're obviously guaranteed to get the same species every time. Where it gets to 1, that would mean that you are guaranteed to get different species every time. And so the higher the diversity in the population, the higher that score is going to be. The Shannon index, again, that increases with increased diversity. There's no theoretical upper limit on what it can be, but it would be very rare to find a population where it's going to be higher than 4.5 or 5, or a population where it's going to be lower than 1 or maybe 0.5 in very extreme cases with a low number of species involved. Generally, we'd consider a score of 2.5 or above to be a moderate level of diversity, and a score of 3 or above to be high diversity. It doesn't really have an easy intuitive interpretation, which you can kind of say, a score of 2.5 means 2.5 units of this. It's much easier to think of it in terms of relative information that it provides about the diversity. Some people do try to give it a true quantitative meaning, but I'm not sure how useful that is. Generally, these two measures are extremely highly correlated. On the screen right now, I've calculated it for every county in the UK based on the bird garden data. And generally, as the Simpson score goes up, the Shannon score will also go up. They're both measures which provide this trade-off between evenness and richness. The other components of diversity that I mentioned, the total abundance and the dominance, they don't factor into it so much. They're related. They're not totally uncorrelated, but they don't drive the definition of these alpha diversity indices in the same way as the evenness and the richness do. So let's look at what the scores are in Merthyr Tydfil. And this is why I happen to pick on this particular county, because from 2023 to 2024, the Shannon-Wiener Diversity Index went up, indicating we have more diversity in 2024 than we did in 2023. And the Simpson Index went down. So that indicated that we had less diversity in 2024 compared to 2023. And that's perhaps the key difference between the two formulae, that in this trade-off between richness and evenness, the Shannon formula weights richness as being a little bit more important than evenness, and the Simpson formula weights the evenness as being a little bit more important than the richness. In most cases, and for nearly every county in the data that I looked at, they're both increasing or they're both decreasing in line with each other. But in this particular example for Merthyr Tydfil, things were a little bit more interesting because we saw one of the key components, the richness, went up, and another of the key components went down. And so here is a scenario where you may see different results depending on which diversity index you choose to calculate. So then, what does that actually mean for our diversity in Merthyr Tydfil? Has it gone up? Has it gone down? Has it more or less stayed the same? I think there's a couple of important points to think about here. And the first one is a methodological point. As I kind of said earlier, knowing the sampling size and the locations and whether we have the same households in the 2 years between 2023 and 2024 will have some influence on the species richness. And if we have more households and more locations in 2024, that may well explain why we are seeing higher richness values. It may not be a true indication of increased diversity. It may just be an indication of more households participating or more sub-areas participating. And that's something which, with the Big Garden Birdwatch, they don't really make the data available to that fine level, so we can't really dig into it as much as we might like to. If we were the people collecting the data and we are seeing something like this and we want to investigate it further, there are statistical techniques known as rarefication, which can help deal with different sampling procedures and try to give you an adjusted figure, because this will influence not just the species richness, but those diversity indices as well, because of how influenced they are by the species richness. The other key point is trying to break down diversity into a single index seems like you've kind of missed the point of diversity in the first place. All of these different components of diversity, looking at the different species, looking at the abundance, looking at the dominant species, looking at the evenness, looking at the richness, considering this as a multivariate analysis and considering diversity as a multivariate concept would seem to be a much more informative way of trying to deal with this rather than picking your favorite index because it's easy to calculate in Excel. So that's something which, in cases where you don't have a clear answer, to me, the clear answer is then that means you're maybe not asking the question in the right way, and we maybe need to bring in a diverse range of diversity indicators to help us understand a little bit better what may be going on.